Most people, when they think about the time of Jesus, immediately picture a spiritual scene: sandals, sermons, miracles, a distant religious world, as if people back then had nothing on their minds except faith. But let's be honest. For someone actually living there, the main thing shaping everyday life wasn't theology. It was money. Or more precisely, the lack of it. The historical world Jesus was born into sat inside one of the harshest and most unequal economic systems the ancient Mediterranean had ever seen. And today, we're going to look at that world not as a story of faith, but as a story of economics. Welcome to The Economic Historian. You're in the place where money, power, and history collide. And here, nothing is ever as simple as it looks. At the beginning of the first century, Judea was inside the Roman Empire, and Rome was the most advanced revenue extraction machine of its time. Rome didn't conquer territories to unite people. It conquered them so the center could grow richer. The job of provinces was to move wealth, grain, silver, labor, flowing from the edges of the empire toward the core. And Judea was one of those edges. And here was the problem. Judea wasn't a wealthy place to begin with. It was largely rural, agricultural, and fragile. Most people live tied to the land, but don't picture modern farms. Most of the time it was a small plot, just enough to grow what you needed to survive. So a bad harvest didn't mean we earned less this year. It meant starvation. And from Rome's point of view, that didn't really matter. Rome governed Judea through a mix of local elites and Roman officials. Kings like Herod ruled with Roman approval. After he died, governors like Pontius Pilate took control, and these men weren't there to raise living standards. Their job was simple: keep order and make sure the flow of money didn't stop. Taxation was the spine of the system. And now we get to the part that's genuinely uncomfortable. Today, when we hear tax, we think of something taken from income, from wages, from profit. But in Judea, taxes were owed no matter what happened. Think of it like being in debt just for existing. Land tax, produce tax, head tax, tolls on roads and in markets, and then religious taxes layered on top of that. Miss a payment, immediate consequences. There was no IRS, no restructuring. No, I filed an appeal, I'm waiting. And on top of all that, tax collection was outsourced. The people known as tax farmers would pay Rome up front to buy the right to collect. Then they'd squeeze the population to get their money back and add profit on top. In a system like that, abuse wasn't a bug. It was the logic. Because to win, you had to squeeze. And if you couldn't pay, you borrowed. Debt was part of almost everyone's life. But don't think of debt the way we do today. No bankruptcy, no restructuring, no bailouts. Interest grew. Collateral was usually land, and one bad year could push a family into a cycle they would never escape. Most of the time the story was the same. A farmer plants, the weather turns, the harvest fails, but taxes still have to be paid. So the farmer borrows, usually from a wealthy landowner or someone connected to the temple elite. Interest kicks in. The next year the yield improves a little, but the debt stays. Then another year, and another, and eventually the land is gone. The farmer becomes a tenant on his own former property, or a day laborer, or just disappears entirely. This wasn't bad luck. It was structural. Over time, land ended up in fewer hands. Large estates replaced small plots. Wealth concentrated around elites who stayed close to Rome and close to the temple administration. Meanwhile, the majority became more and more precarious. This economy didn't just create poverty, it reproduced poverty. And there was no state safety net. Lose your land, no unemployment support, no welfare, no public housing. Family was the only shield. Charity and community support existed, but it was limited. And when too many people fell at once, the system didn't catch anyone. Debt wasn't only financial, it was social. Losing land meant losing status, losing security, losing identity. A family's future could be erased by a drought, a tax increase, or one missed obligation. This is the world Jesus was born into. And here's something that needs to be said clearly. People weren't poor because they were lazy. They weren't poor because they were immoral. They certainly weren't poor because they were cursed. Poverty was something the system depended on. Rome needed surplus. Local elites wanted rent and profit. The temple needed revenue. And all of that pressure landed on the people with the smallest margin for error. And you know what an environment like that produces? Tension. Judea wasn't a calm place. It was constantly boiling. Rebellions happened, banditry rose, and a lot of the time this wasn't simply crime, it was economic desperation. Movements that promise salvation don't emerge in comfort, they emerge in collapse. And this is where modern viewers miss something huge. When people listen to sermons about debt forgiveness, release, justice, and the reversal of the order, they weren't hearing metaphors. They were hearing survival. When they heard the poor, they weren't imagining some charity campaign. They were seeing themselves. Even the word forgiveness in this world wasn't just emotional. It meant debt being erased. It meant a reset. It meant escape. But escape was hard. The Roman system wasn't designed to be humane. It was designed to be efficient. It knew exactly how to pull wealth upward. It tolerated suffering as long as order wasn't threatened. Stability mattered more than fairness. Revenue mattered more than lives. That's why people in Judea felt like they were suffocating. They worked harder, but fell further behind. Productivity didn't become security. Growth didn't save everyone. It lifted a few and pushed the rest down. The economy functioned, but it didn't heal. And most importantly, everyone knew it. No one thought the system was fair. No one felt guaranteed that hard work would save them. People had endurance, growing anger, and this fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, something would break the cycle. And hope is where ideas become dangerous. Because when a system is this tight, even small changes feel revolutionary. Sometimes even words can shake the order. Yeah, especially words. By the time Jesus begins speaking, the economic pressure is already unbearable. The audience is ready, the cracks are obvious, the anger is real, the desperation is rational. This isn't background noise, it's the engine. Now, if you want to understand why Judea's economy felt so inescapable, we need to look at the institution people believed was supposed to protect them, the temple. Most people today think of the temple as purely religious, prayer, sacrifice, spiritual authority. But economically, the temple was one of the region's most powerful financial institutions. It didn't just shape belief, it managed money. A lot of money. The temple sat at the center of a layered system. On one hand, it was sacred. People believed God's presence was there. On the other hand, it functioned like a treasury, like a bank, like a tax authority, and like a court. And those roles weren't separate. Every adult Jewish male had to pay a yearly temple tax. This wasn't optional. It wasn't symbolic. It was required. And the tax had to be paid in a specific silver coin, the Tyrian shekel, because its silver content was consistent. Local currencies weren't accepted. Roman coins weren't accepted. So to pay the temple tax, people had to exchange their money. That's where the money changers came in. And of course, they didn't do it for free. Fees, exchange margins. It was built into the system. Pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem for festivals had to convert currency. Vendors sold sacrificial animals, doves, lambs, cattle, at temple-approved prices. Even if you were poor, you couldn't escape. You might offer smaller sacrifices, but you still paid. Religion didn't reduce the Roman tax burden. It stacked on top of it. And here's the most tense part. The temple elite were deeply intertwined with Rome. High priests weren't chosen by the people. They were appointed with Roman approval. Stability mattered more than righteousness. Cooperation mattered more than justice. So the institution that was supposed to be the moral guide of the people was also part of the economic machine that crushed them. That created a quiet contradiction. The temple spoke about holiness and forgiveness, but in practice it fed debt, inequality, and exclusion. Access to God required payment. Purity required offerings. Forgiveness required sacrifice, and sacrifice required money. If you had no money, you depended on charity. But charity is inconsistent. It can't absorb systemic pressure. It can't reverse land loss. It can't erase debt. It treats symptoms, not causes. And people saw it. In the first century, resentment toward temple authorities was widespread, not because people abandoned faith, but because they saw hypocrisy. The institution meant to mediate between God and the people was starting to look like another extension of elite control. That's why Jesus didn't speak outside the system. He spoke directly into it. When he talked about debt forgiveness, people understood it economically. When he said release, they heard relief. When he talked about the poor, they didn't picture someone far away. They pictured themselves. And when he said the kingdom of God, they didn't hear an abstract idea. They heard an alternative order. This system isn't the final word. That's why his words carried. But words alone don't take down power structures. Behavior does. Jesus didn't openly attack Rome. That would have ended immediately. Instead, he weakened legitimacy. He flipped values. He questioned who deserved authority and why. He made the Roman extraction system and the temple's complicity morally shaky. That's why economic language shows up constantly in his teachings: debt, wages, laborers, vineyards, creditors, stewards, masters, servants. These weren't random metaphors. They were daily life. And then comes the act that changes everything: the disruption in the temple. When Jesus overturned the tables of the money changers, it wasn't only religious anger, it was economic confrontation. He didn't attack prayer. He attacked the system that turned access to the sacred into a transaction. He called it a den of robbers. Not because money existed, but because exploitation had replaced justice. And that crossed a line. Rome tolerated profit. It tolerated teachers. It even tolerated criticism. But it didn't tolerate instability. Temple authorities knew it. Passover filled Jerusalem with crowds, and crowds plus grievance equals rebellion. So in their eyes, Jesus wasn't just preaching. He was interrupting flows. He was making people question legitimacy. He was shaking the balance that kept them in power and kept Rome satisfied. And here's the key point. This conflict wasn't mainly theological. It was economic and political. The system could tolerate suffering. It could tolerate inequality. But it couldn't tolerate people asking, why does this suffering exist, and is it really necessary? Because once people stop accepting debt as destiny, extraction becomes harder to enforce. At this point, Judea was a pressure cooker. Taxes, land loss, debt, religious obligation, political repression, everything converged. Revolt wasn't a question of if, but when. And Rome responded to pressure the way it always did. What happened after Jesus wasn't the collapse of the system. It was the tightening of it. Within a generation, Judea exploded into major revolt. In the year 66, open rebellion began. By 70, Jerusalem was under siege. The temple, the economic, religious, and political center, was dismantled stone by stone. Its treasury was looted. Its priestly hierarchy was wiped out. Hundreds of thousands were killed or displaced. Rome didn't just suppress opposition. It destroyed the infrastructure that made resistance possible and rebuilt control on its own terms. And here's what most people miss. The destruction of the temple didn't end economic extraction. It streamlined it. Roman taxation increased. Land consolidation accelerated. Debt didn't disappear. It became less visible, more bureaucratic, more absolute. In the short term, Rome won decisively. But controlling territory is not the same as controlling the story people tell themselves. Jesus didn't lead an army. He didn't announce a new tax program. He didn't promise to redistribute land. He wasn't trying to replace Roman rule with a rival state. And that's exactly why his impact can't be measured by regime change. What he challenged wasn't Rome's ability to extract. It was the moral logic that made extraction feel inevitable. He weakened the idea that debt was moral failure. He moved forgiveness outside institutional payment. He made the poor central, not defective. And by doing that, he weakened something Rome needed almost as much as legions: legitimacy. Empires can survive suffering, but they struggle when people stop believing suffering is the price of order. After the temple fell, the system didn't vanish, but the critique didn't vanish either. In the years that followed, small communities formed with different assumptions: shared resources, mutual aid, debt relief within the group, loyalty based on belief rather than status. These weren't revolutions, but they were ways of living inside the empire under a different moral logic. Rome could crush armed rebellion easily, but this kind of challenge was harder, because it didn't need land, it didn't need a temple, it didn't need a treasury. It moved with people, it worked under pressure, it survived loss. And over time, something unexpected happened. Rome never fully regained control over the story people told themselves about power, debt, and legitimacy. By the 4th century, the empire couldn't destroy this alternative moral framework. It absorbed it. And by absorbing it, Rome quietly admitted something profound. Authority couldn't rest on force alone anymore. Even power needed moral credibility. The economy of Jesus' time shows us an uncomfortable truth. Systems don't collapse just because they're unjust. They collapse when the stories that justify them stop working. Rome optimized extraction, but it never repaired the moral rupture that made its dominance feel natural. And that's the deeper lesson. Economic systems wrapped in moral language can be incredibly durable. They survive hardship, they survive resentment, they even survive rebellion. But they don't survive one thing: a widespread moment of disbelief. The moment people stop accepting suffering as necessary, deserved, or meaningful. History doesn't repeat exactly, but it reveals patterns. And once you see how power defends itself, not just with force, but with stories, it becomes much harder to believe those stories are accidental. If this narrative shifted your perspective even a little, subscribe, because here we're not just listing events, we're digging into what caused them. History is quiet, but it's full of answers. The real question is whether you know where to look. And on this channel, that's exactly what we do.